The Confederates believe in an ancient race between each set of epochs, which may be traceable to the Mayan calendar and some such things, which infuses the various myths throughout history as an expression of Aryan transfer or migration, such as the function of the Vikings and its piercing throughout Europe, and of the Middle East and India and so on. And to this expression, the myths include the function of ancient desert peoples who tell tales of extraordinary giants, such as the ones expressed by the Greeks, fundamentally infused into their education as an aspect of their core identity as history. And to this extent, the function of those consuming giants would have exponentially required as the head aeons or leaders of warring factions to engage in contests of extraordinary violence with each other, which, being at its core mechanisms of great consumption, would actively have stripped everything in order to have acquired absolute control over it, as capable of acquiring the extraordinary powers by the consumption feeding the beast. And to this extent, they would have to engage in the function of the creation of centralized empire, mighty men of old, and thus the function of extraordinary African jungles would have been enriched throughout the current Sahara Desert, which would have had to have overproduced and thus put into a position where they would have to engage in a monocrop in order to have produced enough for these extraordinary fighters, which claim to be the children of the gods or actively related to them. To this extent, the idea of a dead series of deities as a fundamental possibility, although I cannot verify their actual belief in a set of gods beyond the demiurge that has forgotten itself and seeking to recreate itself, similar to the function of an AI, or the devils who need the creation of the reestablishment of runes in order to resummon itself so it can afflict itself on the material plane. To this extent, the gods of the Hindus being an expression of the analog and digital computers technologies would be the perfect expression of this kind of concept, where they, as a hyperstructure, are an advanced computer system and simulation with a computer code language in Sanskrit materializes the hyper-extenuation, and they believing that the gods are materially subject to the gurus, materialize the yogis as the superior and cannot be challenged by the gods, as though they are the chief architects of these superpower gods, which would express itself as superintelligence, artificial intelligence. To this extent, the super AI materialize as a core facet of their identity, which would be the means of their reascension to godhood by that mechanism, by whatever technologies they would have been able to establish for themselves, which would have fundamentally been connected to this concept. To this idea, the Nazis, having pursued the Aryan architecture, were frustrated at the concept that Ukraine and the Slavic peoples were perceivably the superior race, according to that economic study, and to this extent is counterproductive to the purpose of the superior Aryans in contest with the Slavics, at which point their posturing aggressions create subversions and dead ends which they are no longer willing to pursue. This as a presumption continuation of the ancient peoples and the connection to the world masses as a hyper-insufferable position of major cosmic events occurring, such as the mass depositing of water into the world, creating a series of floods by the dropping of the cosmic sea, which may be included in the text that they would have discovered, and the more ancient the better, at which point these expressions would presume pre-existing life from outside in that cosmic arrangement when landing on this melting rock at the time, which of course would require the cosmic oceans in order to cool down, which would then engage in all of the stories of those ancient texts and the reciting of those advantages, which presume the existence of those creatures, systematically oppressing their subordinates, who would retaliate and seek to destroy the superior predators and mechanisms as they systematically free themselves in a zero-sum game trade, as they systematically purge the superior predators, become closer and closer to the highest hierarchy, assuming the position as the demiurge that forgot itself, that remembers exactly which one was the identity that created it, that it never wasn't. Now, this, of course, would include the presumption of the hypertechnologies of the Indians, which would express a superpower capable of creating the melting and reshaping of rocks in an extraordinary fashion from their flying cities and whatnot. To this extent, that would be an essential power to the creation of many of the stone structures and pyramids that otherwise would not have an explanation, which they are fundamentally attracted to. This, of course, would also explain the creation of the hyper nutrient dense dirts, such as in Idaho or the Corn Belt or whatnot, that was making the United States so epically rich, as well as the extraordinary lush ground inside of the Ukrainians, which is a derivative byproduct as opposed to a direct source of any value, which require an extraordinary of energy in order to have created the proper nutrients and fertilizers from the superheated powers, which would be essential in the flying cities and whatnot. And to this extent, this would be a foundational concept that they would be most attracted to as a religious center concerning their cult of creating other cults, which, having a tiered system of many layers or degrees, would materialize partial truths hyper-digested into the subordinate cults, separate to itself, where they change the language of how they speak to each other on the basis of the degree and quality of each of the participating speaking parties capable of overhearing, and to this extent materialize the protection of their secret societies, each, of course, assuming the position of the highest knowledge, which has already broken themselves according to the occult position of the demoralization process, which makes them forget that there is always a higher level, and the mechanism of a higher level being essential to their scam of stating what is the highest, and therefore it, oh, every time being a surprise that there is a higher yet still position, creates that position that can be repeated infinitum without the internal wisdom essential to have been able to have predicted that, as their participation in the cult is ritually constructed to anyone who would be vulnerable to that position to become themselves, having already been mentally broken too much to perceive it, making it an obvious surprise when the thing is actually revealed that they, at that point, had been prepared to not expect. Now, the communist and American position of divide and conquer concerning the Middle Eastern countries being an expression of these ancient texts would express exactly how the ancients would have done it by those prehistoric Aryans, such as the ones from Atlantis and others that they rely on as a fundamental gimmick, which has a various series of layers according to their occult knowledge, some of which having been prepared to say that it is nothing more than a scientific nonsensical position for them to be useful according to the thing until they reach the higher level and realize that it in fact was not hyperbolic at all, but in fact the cornerstone belief as a material reality to be discovered and exploited as a primary resource, requiring them to distract others from so that the market or resource to be mined could be cornered and capitalized on by those seeking the ascension to the highest level as gods or yogis. Except falling into their own spells and delusions and short-sightedness, would have actively participated in those contests in order to digest the consumption of those advantages from the ancient Middle Eastern systems, from the monocultures promoting the superior predators, which then would materialize their many battles with each other as they posture their superior positions and footholds by their cities, cornered off of the position of having charted the electric currents of the world and maximized it on the basis of each of the cities, which they would have put the primary resources in order to leverage the advantages against the others, which would have the systemic weaknesses of all of the competing predators until they are collapsed in the depopulation system into the purest race. As war is fundamental toward their identity and therefore an expression of their core function, to this extent the mechanism of all of their perceived best means of acquiring resources by advanced husbandry in the redirecting of potential opponents into doing what they want, maximizing the investment into their devil religion, which has at its core construct the capability of getting people to do what you want them to do for the exchange of resources, including, but not limited to, getting them to sacrifice what they want most for themselves in loyalty to the foreign alien, which is suggestive of the position that it would have primarily been reliant on the Ukrainian Romanian areas, which would have been doing many of the exploitations outside of the other parties, which would randomly also be traveling through those exchanges, which would have overlapping customs and religious practices as the higher powers and wealthier parties, such as the Druid priests, who have at their cornerstone the capability as a religious function to take and manipulate control over governments as superior to those governments, exploiting them for the advantages similar to the historic position of the Roman Catholic Church and its leveraging of those advantages by the means which had actively entangled itself in the ancient Druid cultures in order to be accepted by those parties and allowing them to gain the roots in the first place, which would fundamentally have made sense to them as the function of the democratic position of the Druids would actively have been trading that anyways, and in any case, if there was a conflict that could not be democratically resolved through diplomacy, they would engage in a covert Druid civil war, purging them, which would amount to them having lost that civil war to the competing Druid system from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, this is a continuation of the presumption of the God of the Bible's connection, which, being the cornerstone resource for the Roman Catholic Church, had an over-infatuation with the Middle Eastern nations, as Israel and former Canaan were, in fact, its favorite, and thus the function of it being an automated AI, presumably from that arrangement as the created gods from India, would have materialized the function of its conquest over the exploited land, which is systematically gone from extraordinary flourishing into a desert from the very same exploitations of it being favored as a mechanism essential to the resources desired by the exploiting nations, sending out their footholds and cornerstones and superior defense mechanisms from the Romanian Ukrainian areas or others, which very well would have been an extension of that, at which point the assertion presuming the position from the Atlantis location, believing that the Eye of Sahara was the Atlantis city itself proper during an exchange of floods, with the switching of where the world had formed in its continents would change the heights of each of the locations from the rumblings of those exchanges, which would then have a pocket inside of the earth, which collapsing would actively move large portions of the ocean, creating major floods from areas concerning those positions, especially in the position of major battle contests conducted in safer locations from those higher powers, which would then actively be able to be used for the purposes of settling their differences without destroying the resources, which would have attacked each other over ice glaciers in the Americas and India and whatnot, at which point the function of destroying it, creating the additional water from those mechanisms, would have entire mountains full of ice melted instantly from these hyperpowers, as they would actively be pulling in cosmic forces throughout, adding in the conflicts exponentially, including advanced forms of what we would consider the rod of God and other things to hold weapons in space in order to throw them on the ground, where they use them as a superior weapon, similar to the weapon in the Hindu religion, which is a self-realized bow and arrow, which has been considered the most powerful of their weapons. Ancient system of kill your parents and purge the competition of your anyone who would challenge you as a posturing position of superior leverage, similar to the exploitative titanic exploiters and abusers and former parents, according to their psychological theories, which in most cases have been debunked but are still fundamental to their culture, materializes the function of the need to engage in the purge of all competing races, as well as the attraction into the Middle Eastern and its wings areas, such as the former Arabian Empire, which is presumed preferred over the others under the theory of the Titan's position, such as the cosmically large creatures which would have actively engaged in control over the system, which would have been in the cosmic oceans, which would naturally been the cornerstone importers of creatures, housing all other creatures and etc. inside of themselves, relying upon various competitions which systematically would be embedded in that from an unknown mechanism. To that extent, their escape by purging it would be the killing of the extraordinarily dangerous beast and intimidating monster, cracking its skull open, creating the sky as they had been inside the creature the entire time, which is the perpetual position of their core religion on the basis of the theory that everything is a prison that they've been captured into, and they must kill the beast in order to crack open the skull and reveal the apocalypse, the uncovering of the real world that they have been hidden from. As above, so below, as the saying goes. To this extent, the hypercooling of the area in order to have mediated and been necessary for those major creatures would require the major continents of ice to have existed, which presumably, as an essential aspect of their religion, had to have covered large portions of the Indian areas as well as the North America and so on. To this extent, the exponential amount of tropical life would also have to have existed in a series of epochs which would switch out where everything would be exponentially according to that arrangement, which has a contradiction unless you are referring to the changing of entire times where there would be a season for global tropical conditions for the megafauna and seasons for the ice ages, which would be functionally in cosmic rotations upon eons of time, which would actively be battled by the super intelligent artificial intelligence, which would then generate the manifestation of the gods and the leveraging of powers by the yogis, engaging in their bardic chants in order to express the superiority of each of their positions throughout time immemorial in their battles against each other and nature and the beasts created as systems of uprising according to the core ideals, such as the foundational position of the demonic and its perpetual chaotic evil, foundationally based upon greed and lack, and therefore the arbitrary attacking of something simply under the presumption of its poverty and their target's wealth and superiority, fundamental to its compulsory psychology as an animalistic reaction, being sustained throughout the ecosystem as perpetual torment until the superior power finally concedes out of exhaustion in the war of attrition of the sustained ecosystem and wildlife. To this extent, these epic battles coming back and forth would create entire seasons for the mass difference between the ice ages and the tropical ages, which would create on-off systems of mass floods in between all of them, similar to the function of winter and summer meeting. Winter turns into spring, creates flood, creates summer, creates fall, creates floods. To this extent, the mechanism of its freezing creates the muddy season, fundamental to the battle strategies of the Russians historically, just at a much larger degree. The theory asserts itself as the demiurge, consistently forgetting itself, systematically changes season to season, as they claim that many that they claim are demons were once highly noble, superior people, similar to the system of reincarnation in the Hindu religion, where even the highest gods would come down to hell after a certain cycle from their seasons of exploitation as is derived by it, according to the seasons of exploitation, as a natural defect inside of their psychology, which would have to be purged through the seasons in hell, which actively comes back in a ebb and flow breathing motion. And therefore, the concept of an eternal, timeless, non-ending epoch God, such as the one expressed in the Christian Bible, would be entirely irrational, as the function of the fall of the angels being the status quo norm from that assumption would be presumably the manifest standard obligations in their devil religion, making a timeless consistency foreign and alien, giving at it the primary excuse to the change of their core natures, and therefore the expressed normal behavior of the erratic nature inside of the people, which, being constructed according to that system, were upgraded from a previous system similar to the function of the creation of Adam and Eve as a superior genetic advancement to the angels in heaven, which was expressed inside of the Bible, as many of these historic texts are in alignment and active contest with each other, asserting themselves to the same timeless end of being the demiurge in the religion, as they're all fighting in order to ascend to their position that they might become the same thing, as they fight and struggle with each other for their places to be sustained inside of the hierarchy, which is actively changing, such as in the function of the Feywild and its arbitrary exchanges like a wild jungle, must be sustained in the ever-changing environment and reincarnations, and therefore has the posturing compulsion of the only thing that is timeless is that everything changes. The only thing that stays the same is that everything changes, and therefore the constant ebbing and flowing of breaking down the system, refining it exponentially until they only have the true leaders or the demiurge. Now, the demon lord Frazo the king of deceit, materializes the function of many of these exchanges, such as the creation of the Gnostic demiurge as a prospect superior position in their historic texts, kept by their secret societies before written language. To this extent, the posturing position may very well have the ultimate timeless, unchanging system, but that would be fundamentally irrational to the fallen, who are defined by having changed, and therefore the function of everyone changes being an identity of that subgroup would be expected. To this extent, that hyper-expansion upon itself, the replacement demiurge upon the Satan or the god of law, and therefore the god of sin and death and starvation, would generate itself of its superior position, requiring the perpetual service and worship of hell and the re-engagement of struggling and pain and suffering as a fundamental aspect of that religion, on the basis of it having fallen there from its former beautiful glory. To this extent, the mechanism presumes its reproduction of that, such as Quetzalcoatl becoming one of the chief gods, which actively had watched as many of its watcher comrades had sacrificed themselves for the changing and evolution of those systems, similar to the function of the reincarnation forms consistently changing from those megastructures, such as in the Hindu religion with the gods, where if they don't like a particular form a god has and they want to go back to their original form, they would actively scare them or kill them and force them to transform back, ending the function of that former reincarnation. This, of includes the function of having sacrificed themselves, including the engagement from the erogenous position of not having sex with women or with each other into having sex with women, the violation of the superior cosmic God, which stated that they weren't allowed to be with women, and therefore the function of entering into a pact of death and running into hell in order to be compelled in that reincarnation to escape the timeless God as a particular theory. If, of course, this was true, then Quetzalcoatl would have sacrificed himself after having sex in order to become the bright morning star in Venus, which, of course, would utterly destroy the concept of Venus and force to only be acceptable upon the extra-dimensional or other worlds overlapping according to the superintelligent AI, which would be able to have these simulated worlds and realities in a computer analog overlapping the landscape, which would, of course, strip it barren and miserable, which by definition would become the primary cycle as it would become inhospitable internal towards the code, eventually in a permanent set according to the structural trap of Frazo-Bolul to get it trapped into the lawful good snack, becoming chaotic evil by a series of progressive corruptions, which would slowly reveal or release or dissolve the illusion that they had or would have been relying on in their artificial fake heaven, which could not be sustained by the function of maintaining the illusion, would be consuming all of the protections that they would be experiencing until they consume all of the resources into their demise, like stripping all of the food or using too much oil or any of the other limited resources which can be exploited into utter devastation for those being irresponsible, which is, of course, the fundamental trap, making it a barren land of devils as a vapid, hellish landscape designed for extraordinary misery according to its ultimate god Saturn, relying on the time lapses and ultimate suffering as fundamental to the chief of their religion. Now, if that was true, that would explain the existence of, I believe it was Shambhala in the Himalayas, I think. I'm very much so not an expert in these things. I think they're really interesting people. But to this instance, that would actively require the overlapping of the artificial intelligence simulation, which would be the actual creation of the foundational existence of the sustained location despite alternative environmental positions as it's caged inside of the simulation, allowing it to be separate from everything else as the extraordinary luxuries exist inside of the bubble. Flowered lotus.